Welcome to this presentation, An Introduction to Information Risk Management in Healthcare. I'm Andrew Rodriguez. I'm creating this presentation for my study group. They're studying for a HIPAA CHPS, but the information is also relevant to anyone taking security certification tests that cover information risk management with a focus on healthcare. The objective of this presentation is to provide you a basic understanding of the following concepts: information security, risk management, risk assessments, risk analysis, risk treatments, and controls. Working in security, you'll hear of the security triad, which is maintaining the confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information. The way I like to think about it is that privacy defines what we protect, security defines how we protect it. In Section 164.306, it states that covered entities and business associates are required to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all electronic protected health information the covered entity or business associate creates, receives, maintains, or transmits. There are two key points to note. First, there's more than just confidentiality. Healthcare privacy and security professionals are required to maintain the integrity and availability of EPHI. For example, consider ransomware. This is malware that encrypts files that are not accessible by the end user. In cases where the information is encrypted but not transmitted outside of the covered entity, the confidentiality may not be compromised. However, the integrity and availability of the data is compromised. Thus, a violation of the HIPAA security rule has occurred. Further evaluation would need to be done to determine if a breach has occurred, but that is outside the scope of this presentation. Second, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about security is the data or information a business associate or covered entity creates or transmits. But keep in mind that what the security rule says, that they are also responsible for the information they receive or maintain. For example, if a physician sends a hospital information about a patient, the hospital is responsible for protecting that information. Risk analysis, risk assessment, and risk management are foundational concepts to understand in information risk management. These concepts are a common thread that you'll find in most information risk frameworks. However, when you compare one framework to another, you'll find that these concepts are organized a little differently. For example, one framework might state that a risk analysis is part of a risk assessment, while another framework will say that a risk assessment is part of the risk analysis. The definitions are the same, it's just how they're organized is different. Now, packaging all of this together, the risk assessment, the risk analysis, and other processes, that's what we call the risk management program. When we look closer at information risk management, we're looking at risk caused by man or individuals, nature, and environmental factors. Acts of man is a common phrase used in information risk management to describe theft, loss, or destruction caused by an individual or group of individuals. Acts of nature is used to describe flooding, lightning, wind, hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. Environmental impact or environmental acts is used to describe as events that cause a loss of power, water, cooling, and connectivity. All these are referred to as a security threat, and that is what is evaluated in risk analysis and assessments. As mentioned, the focus of this presentation is information risk management within healthcare. So as you know, that means our standard is HIPAA. The Security Rules Section 164.308 states that a covered entity and business associate must complete a risk analysis, which is to conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risk and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information. The model here is to complete a risk assessment and then to perform a risk analysis. However, determining risk is not the end of the story. All of this falls under risk management, which is to implement security measures sufficient to reduce risks and vulnerabilities to a reasonable and appropriate level to comply with the security rule. Often people hear of HIPAA as a floor to security. HIPAA was never meant to be prescriptive, but it does set the standard that the data must be protected. To me, this isn't the floor, but the foundation of what is required. Furthermore, HIPAA requires that an organization have policies and procedures to meet the requirements of the standards in addressable items. Old school models see privacy and security as two distinct roles. However, newer models have privacy and security integrated to ensure proper decisions are made about protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all PHI. Remember, an organization must complete an assessment and then an analysis, and then manage the risks. Now keep in mind, the security rule does not say that the goal is zero risk. It says that you are to reduce it or to implement security measures sufficient to reduce risk and vulnerabilities to a reasonable and appropriate level to comply with the security rule. What is reasonable and appropriate? That is something that each organization will have to determine on their own. Now, there are different ways to respond to risk, which we'll cover in depth later. Some organizations may accept a specific risk as long as they are not breaking the law, and that is their decision. All of this is called the risk appetite, and that is how much risk an organization is willing to accept. For example, an organization may decide to encrypt all removable drives, whereas another organization may require to only encrypt removable drives that contain PHI. The encrypt all organization does not have much of a risk appetite and chooses to have everything encrypted. While this is technically not required, it is a good practice to reduce the risk of a breach. The other organization has more of a risk appetite. They may rely on people and policies to prevent a breach. But mistakes happen, and this decision increases the risk of a breach. Now, who makes that decision? It may be the board or an executive. It may be delegated to a privacy or security officer, or it may be through a committee or work group. Each organization handles it differently. So, what is risk? NIST defines risk as a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, and typically a function of the adverse impacts that would arise if the circumstance or event occurs and the likelihood of occurrence. Note there are a few key words: likelihood, impact, and adverse. We'll take a closer look at those later. So let's break this down. First of all, it's a measurement. It's determined by analysis. It's about a potential circumstance or event, and the result of that circumstance or event is an adverse impact. We'll look at the measurement and analysis in a bit, but for now let's focus on the idea of potential circumstance or event. We are not only to plan for known threats, but for potential threats or unknown threats. Here are a couple of examples to help digest this concept. 1. Hurricanes. Organizations that operate near the coast should be prepared in advance for a hurricane. Waiting for a tropical storm to turn into a Category 1 hurricane isn't a good practice. An organization should evaluate the likelihood and impact of a hurricane. Preparation would be different for a hospital that is in a location that is hit every year versus one that is hit every 10 years. Additionally, a hospital within a mile of the coast would prepare differently than a hospital that is 30 miles from the coast. 2. USB drives. Consider an infection control nurse that keeps all of her data on an encrypted USB drive. From a confidentiality perspective, we don't have anything to worry about. However, what is the likelihood and impact that USB drive is lost or damaged? Does this impact the integrity of the data? Or does this impact the availability of the data? If the data is backed up routinely, this may not have a huge impact. Or if the data is simply reports that can be regenerated, it would not be a huge impact. But if the data was not backed up and it was original data, then there is a potential that the security rule has been violated. In Paul Hopkins' book Risk Management, he references the Old English Dictionary's definition of risk: a chance or possibility of danger, loss, injury, or other adverse consequence. He continues by providing a definition of at risk by saying it is when something is exposed to danger. The author elaborates on the definition by saying that in this context, risk is used to signify negative consequences. To undertake risk management within an organization, a definition of risk that is more aligned with business activities is required. So what does this mean to a healthcare organization? Risk must take into consideration of business activities and regulatory requirements, especially when it comes to clinical care. This does not excuse violations of HIPAA requirements. What this means is that risk must be framed with clinical, operational, financial, and technical considerations. Hockman also references a definition used by a particular council. Risk can be defined as the chances of something happening or not happening that will have an influence upon the achievement of business objectives. A risk can also be the failure to take advantage of opportunities to optimize a council achieving its planned objectives. Risk can be an action or inaction when action is needed. This is an important concept when it comes to the assessment of controls. Risk describes the negative consequences of action or inaction. A mentor of mine used to tell me that you can't have a problem if you don't have a standard, and I've used this advice often within my career. The adoption of standards is what defines what action or inaction is positive or negative. So how do you tie all of this together in regards to information risk management? A risk assessment is about determining if an organization is doing the right thing, that is, following policies, procedures, and standards. Additionally, risk assessments evaluate if technical and physical safeguards are appropriate to the objective. The question remains, if we're evaluating policies, procedures, standards, technical and physical safeguards, how do we organize this? Risk assessments evaluate controls, which are implementation based on regulatory requirements, best practices, and organizational decisions. Controls are evaluation points of an assessment. Controls are often organized into frameworks. Regulatory requirements would come from the HIPAA privacy, security, and breach rules, and Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. A common industry requirement would come from the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, often referred to as simply PCI. Best or leading practices would come from NIST, ISO, HITRUST, and COBIT, for example. These frameworks, however, are often built to map to the implementation of regulatory standards. Let's take a closer look at the definition of control, which an auditor calls an internal control. Internal control is broadly defined as a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designated to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in the following categories: effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of financial reporting, compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The first category is about best and leading practices. The second is about integrity of data in regards to financial reporting, and third is where the HIPAA, privacy, security, and breach rules apply. This ties back to the early discussion we had about risk management, that the goal is to ensure that an organization is meeting its objectives. Now let's look at a real-life example of a control. If you have something valuable in your house, you want to protect it. And as the value of the item increases, so does the level of protection. If you have something minor you want to protect, you may put it in a box with a simple lock that uses a key like the one on the far left. However, if it's something more valuable, you may want to use a more complex lock that is keyed different than other locks. If it is something that you need other people to access but you still want protection, you might use a combination lock. However, if it's something so valuable that you could not risk losing, you would put it in a safe. This is an example of a preventive control, one that prevents something bad from occurring. However, sometimes a lock isn't enough or can't be used. For example, think about a museum where valuable paintings might be damaged by moving them into a vault every night. In this case, there are other controls you might use. As this slide demonstrates, there are different types of controls, and we'll look at those in the next slide. The security guard is an example of a preventive control, but can also be a detective control. If the security guard detects that someone is trying to break in, He or she can call the police or scare the burglars away by turning on an alarm. A sign is considered a deterrent control, which means it reduces the occurrence of a threat. And finally, the dog. Well, that's a preventive, detective, corrective, and deterrent control all wrapped up into one furry beast. As mentioned, there are different types of controls. A preventive control is one that stops unwanted activity of a threat. A detective control discovers or exposes a threat. A corrective control mitigates or lessens the impact of a threat. A recovery control restores status to conditions prior to the threat. And a deterrent control reduces the occurrence of a threat. Now, let's take a look at these individually. A preventive control stops an unwanted activity from a threat. For example, antivirus software is a preventive control because it intercepts viruses from infecting a workstation. Another example would be usernames and passwords for systems, as they prevent unauthorized access to information. A detective control discovers or exposes a threat. Once again, let's consider antivirus. It is a detective control because it can detect a virus in an email attachment or a downloaded file. The antivirus software also scans for signatures or behavior on a system that would indicate a virus. A corrective control mitigates or lessens the impact of a threat. An example of a corrective control would be the ability to wipe a phone, tablet, or laptop remotely if it were stolen or lost. A solution that encrypts emails that contain PHI would be considered a detective control because it detects PHI in emails in attachments, and corrective because it automatically encrypts emails. Again, in consideration of antivirus, it would be a corrective control because it can remove a virus from a workstation. A recovery control mitigates or lessens the impact of a threat. A recovery control would be the policy and procedure for backing up and restoring systems or information in the event a system crashes. Business continuity and disaster recovery planning are also examples of recovery controls. Deterrent controls reduce the occurrence of a threat. A common deterrent control is the beware of dogs sign. In hospitals, it could be the sanctions policy or medical record access audits. When the workforce members know that a hospital routinely reviews their access to PHI, that could deter them from browsing through medical records where they do not have a need to know. In general information security, you'll find that controls are categorized into management, technical, and operational groups. However, in HIPAA, controls or standards are categorized into administrative, physical, and technical groups. As mentioned earlier, we'll be looking at the information risk management model provided by NIST. This includes the process of framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring risk. Framing risk is the first component of our information risk management program. The purpose is to establish a context of what will be assessed and managed. Framing risk defines what is in scope and what is out of scope, and includes the documentation and inventory of these items. According to NIST, risk assessments are used to identify, estimate, and prioritize risk to organizational operations, that is the mission, functions, image, and reputation of an organization, organizational assets, individuals, and other organizations resulting from the operation and use of information systems. Again, according to NIST, the purpose of risk assessments is to inform decision makers and support risk responses by identifying the four following items. First, relevant threats to organizations are threats directed through organizations against other organizations. Second, vulnerabilities both internal and external to organizations. Third, impact, that is harm to organizations that may occur given the potential for threats exploiting vulnerabilities. Fourth, the likelihood that harm will occur. The end result is a determination of risk, that is, typically a function of the degree of harm and the likelihood of harm occurring. Again, this information is provided by NIST and it comes from their guidance on risk management. I'll provide links at the end of the presentation. Now, the assessment evaluates if an organization meets the requirement of a control, which is typically tied to a policy, procedure, or standard. Now, there are three types of assessments. There are quantitative, qualitative, and semi-quantitative. Quantitative looks at discrete data. A quantitative assessment ties a number or dollar amount to a control. Qualitative looks at the evaluation and the categorization of an item, usually done by an expert. For example, determining the likelihood of an occurrence of a risk is usually measured in low, medium, or high, when it is either impossible or too difficult to do a quantitative analysis. Semi-quantitative is a hybrid approach that ties a numerical weight to the qualitative measurement so that it can be used in calculations. According to NIST, the third component of risk management addresses how organizations respond to risk once that risk is determined based on the results of a risk assessment. The purpose of the risk response component is to provide a consistent organization-wide response to risk in accordance with the organizational risk frame by the following four items. First, developing alternative courses of action for responding to risk. Second, evaluating the alternative courses of action. Third, determining the appropriate courses of action consistent with organization risk tolerance. And finally, fourth, implementing risk responses based on selected courses of action. Responding to risk may be called a corrective action plan or a risk treatment. Now, here are the most common types of responses: risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk sharing, and risk mitigation. Risk acceptance is allowing operations within a known risk to continue. Risk acceptance typically applies to risks where there is a low impact or low likelihood of occurrence, or when it is not possible to apply other risk responses. An example of risk acceptance would be to allow a special medical imaging workstations to run an outdated operating system because the vendor had not received FDA clearance to upgrade it. An example of risk avoidance would be to retire the imaging workstation mentioned before. Another example would be to remove an affected workstation from the network, or to suspend email during a massive attack where malware is being delivered via email until antivirus software is updated. Risk sharing is also called risk transfer. It is allowing another party to accept risk on your behalf. In HIPAA, the concept of business associate is an example of risk sharing or risk transfer. If a breach occurs by the business associate, then the financial impact falls on the business associate. Another example is cybersecurity insurance or breach insurance. Risk mitigation is the process of removing or reducing the impact or likelihood of an occurrence of risk. An example of this would be patching workstations or updating antivirus definitions. There are a few key definitions you need to know about responding to risk. First is inherent risk, and that is the risk that would exist if no controls or mitigating factors were in place. So if you were doing absolutely nothing to protect from a certain risk, that would be called inherent risk. Residual risk is a risk that remains after an organization's effort to respond to the risk. So whatever risk remains after the organization responds, that is called residual risk. First is inherent risk, and that is the risk that would exist if no controls or mitigating factors were in place. So if you were doing absolutely nothing to protect from a certain risk, that would be called inherent risk. Residual risk is a risk that remains after an organization's effort to respond to the risk. So whatever risk remains after the organization responds, that is called residual risk. According to NIST, the fourth component of risk management addresses how organizations monitor risk over time. Purpose of the risk monitoring component is defined in these three items. First, determine the ongoing effectiveness of risk responses, consistent with the risk organizational frame. Second, identify risk impacting changes to organizational information systems and the environment in which the systems operate. Third, verify that planned risk responses are implemented and information security requirements derived from and traceable to organizational mission, business functions, federal legislation, directives, regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines are satisfied. Again, a link will be provided at the end of the slide so you'll have access to the documentation from NIST. The monitoring component of information risk management is one that organizations do not apply sufficient attention to, or is completely overlooked. Too often, organizations implement monitoring as part of an overall risk information management program. That is, that they evaluate or they do the monitoring once a year. Monitoring applies to controls, not the entire program. Some controls need to be evaluated once a year, some quarterly, some monthly, some daily, some even in real time. Now notice the model is not assess and respond, and that's the implementation many organizations have in place. Monitoring provides not only oversight, but it provides protections by making sure that specific controls are reviewed on a regular basis, or as a result of changes to the technical infrastructure, regulatory requirements, or organizational structure. Monitoring could be part of a compliance program of the organization or a dashboard or reports that are reviewed by the Chief Information Security Officer or Chief Information Officer, if not the board. Additionally, monitoring might occur within the organization's change management program. A key part of evaluating risk is determining the likelihood and the impact of risk. And this is the analysis part. Organizations will have to decide on what their risk tolerance or risk appetite is, and that is how much risk are they willing to accept. These characteristics are often attributed by qualitative descriptors, where the likelihood is ranked from 1, which is not likely, to 5, which is extremely likely, or simply by using low, medium, or high. Let's look at an example of a hospital planning for environmental threats, such as a hurricane, as part of their risk management program. They would need to consider the likelihood and impact to the hospital based on previous incidents. In this example, the analysis concluded that on average a hurricane hits the area once every 5 years. However, the impact to the hospital is significant. Because it's located in a flood zone, hospital staff are not able to return to work, therefore delaying the opening of the hospital. Based on the analysis of likelihood and impact, the hospital determines that the risk to the business is significant. The risk of the business being affected by a hurricane is significant, and this information should be used in the planning for future hurricanes and how the hospital will respond. Now, from a HIPAA perspective, an organization must identify the impact to all systems that contain PHI. This is called a data criticality analysis, which is often part of a much larger process called a business impact analysis. Now keep in mind, this is not only the EMR, it applies to all PHI. For example, PHI that's in the billing and financial systems. Finally, it's important to understand the difference between two standards within HIPAA. In addition to having an information risk management program, healthcare organizations are also required to complete what's called an evaluation. The process of an evaluation consists of ensuring that controls, policies, procedures, and standards that are related to the security of ePHI are aligned with the following items: changes to HIPAA rules, changes to the environment, and changes to the operations. Remember, organizations implement HIPAA standards differently. Smaller organizations have a smaller set of controls, whereas larger organizations would have a much larger set of controls. And as organizations grow and technology changes, it's important that healthcare organizations go back and do an evaluation to make sure that all of their controls, policies, procedures, and standards are in alignment with the HIPAA security, the privacy, and breach rules. This concludes an introduction to information risk management in healthcare. Provided on the screen are key resources for further information on this topic. You'll find a publication from NIST on risk management and a link for the HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification rules.